And good morning to everybody in attendance today in Research in Action 19 at ÚNICA. I'm Dr. Raúl Alberto Mora. I'm broadcasting today from Medellin. And I want to take a moment just to remind everybody that I'm in a land that's ancestrally been under the care and protection of the Embera, the Senu, the Kunatule, and other originary peoples who have inhabited Antioquia for quite some time. And I think in a time like this, it's crucial to remember that legacy, to remember that history as we think about our future. I'll take a moment also to thank everybody at ÚNICA for the invitation to this beautiful event that you host every year, every semester. I've been keeping track of what you do, and I'm really happy to see these kinds of events happening more and more in Colombia, in our ELT community. So I'm very grateful and very excited to be joining you this morning in my keynote address, where I will share with you some of the journey that my research team and I have had when it comes to this process of developing academic literacies. As we start the session, it's important to always put academic work in perspective and be aware that we're not here today because we're turning our back on what's happening in our nation, but that this is a good moment to reflect on the possibilities for using academic work in a writing as a way to heal, as a way to rebuild, as a way to think of a better society, to think of a better world. That academic work, and this is all the way from the ideas of critical literacy, that as academics we have a social responsibility, and our social responsibility is to think through our writing, through the things we talk about, through the things we teach, what kind of world we can build, what kind of futures we can build together. So with that initial consideration, I welcome you to this talk. The talk will have 4 moments as I show in the agenda. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the difficulties that sometimes we have dealing with academic literacies. Then we will talk a little bit about how my team and I are conceptualizing academic literacies as a discovery. I'll show 2 examples of that development of academic literacies, and then I'll bookend it by talking about how academic literacies is a source, it's a possibility for community building. So first, the first question, why are academic literacies so difficult sometimes? Well, all the time, or some of the time. First, and for every session, at every beginning of every section, I'm going to throw a quote from a very famous writer, just as a way to elicit some conversation. So in this first section, I want to share this quote by famed African-American writer Toni Morrison. If there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And I think that applies to the work we do. If someone hasn't done the work, let's do it ourselves. So let's talk a little bit about these difficulties that we have when it comes to academic literacies. It's been my experience that we all struggle with this at some point in our careers, in some point in our development, in some point in our learning process. Some of the difficulties or the issues that we have to face have to do with language issues, with the development of the discourse competence that is required to engage in academic registers. There is also all the social conventions in terms of style, in terms of the assessment of the texts. We're talking here about things like the APA style or the MLA style or the Chicago style. We're talking about the peer review process. We're talking about all the little elements that comprise the academic literacy process. And then there is, of course, all the social linguistic markers that make part of academic literacies. There are some particular structures that different genres in academic discourse favor. There is how we construct the text, whether it's when we talk or when we write. And there are different academic registers. Registers like the way you talk when you're giving a lecture, or when you're giving a presentation, or when you're giving a keynote, as in this case, or when you're teaching. Those are different registers that are part of the academic literacy process. And sometimes we don't recognize them because we haven't talked about them at length. But then there is another issue that has to do with how academic literacies, when we look at them historically and we look at them anthropologically, they're very artificial. And you see the picture in the back, it's a cave painting. And I always like to talk about this for a little bit. And this idea that academic writing is something that is very, very recent. We have been writing academically for a very short period of time, and very systematically for a few centuries. So when we put in perspective that we have been around for at least 200,000 years or so, the planet is 4.6 billion years old. When you put in that perspective, and again, you go back into how long we've been here as a species, that we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years versus centuries. There are certain parts of evolution that don't necessarily fit with those social conventions that I mentioned in the first slide. In the first slide. Some of those social conventions don't fit. And that makes the process of academic literacy development that is something artificial, something we have to learn, something we have to really formally be introduced to. And in order to really internalize it, it takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of formal mentoring. So it's not something that's automatic. It's not something that is innate. Language is innate. Language production is innate. Text is innate. Text production is innate to the human nature. Writing academic papers is not. And that means that I have to accommodate to that particular register, have to accommodate to that particular language. And then we have to also start thinking that academic literacies is a process that has to be scaled up and scaffolded. So as I was saying in the previous slide, we need to gradually introduce novice researchers and novice teachers and novice learners gradually introduced into these academic discourses and registers. We cannot expect students to simply start writing an academic text out of nowhere, out of the blue. There has to be a gradual induction process where students can appropriate the conceptual and the practical tools that you need for academic communication, those registers, those structures, those social conventions. And that requires a formal training and development of academic discourse competence. And you can hear in the background, Connor and Duncan MacLeod. Probably if we do this live, you might be able to also get a bit of a cameo appearance, as they'll be in the apartment during the time I'm at board of the event. So I just wanted to mention that as part of this presentation. Back to this, academic literacies then are something that we have to create a structure around and really get people formally introduced to, so they can do it well and they can do it properly. That brings me to the second point. So how do we conceptualize academic literacies as this discovery? And I bring another quote, this time Ernest Hemingway, when he says, "We are all apprentices in a craft where no one ever becomes a master." Academic discourse, it's in that sense this. We are all learning. No one can fully master the academic discourse. I'm still mastering elements of the academic discourse, and I've been teaching for 28 years, and I've been in higher education for 11, and I'm still learning. So there is hope. And there is this realization that this process never ends. In our work, we are conceptualizing the idea of this idea of developing academic literacies, initially from a 3-point framework, where we start with street ideological moral literacy, and this, sorry, and this notion that literacy practices are socially situated. It means that if I'm here, being here influences the way I'm going to develop those literacies, and that I cannot detach them from the social issues, I cannot detach from the social linguistic issues surrounding me, and that I need to think of literacy practice as something epistemological that becomes instrumental practices. So academic literacy is above everything an epistemological affair that then we translate into instrumental techniques that help you master it. Then there is the idea of big D and little d discourse that Jim G talked about, where there is an element of this discourse that is the macro. Some of the larger social conventions that are overarching, that are transnational, that are global in nature, that we all abide by. And then there is the little d, which is the micro, some of the smaller social individual elements of language. So academic discourse, it's both academic big D discourse and little d discourse. It's understanding the social conventions of the field where you're at, but also understanding some of the nuances that the local community, some of the local flavor that in our case, for example, we in Colombia, we are given to the academic discourse and academic literacies. And then there is the notion of academic literacy itself, based on the work of Brian Street. And this idea that, again, we go into the epistemological, that academic literacy is an epistemological issue, it's not simply skills you develop. It's an epistemological approach to discourse and communication, where I am aware that there are issues of discourse and power. And as I recognize those power dynamics, I also begin to infuse the curriculum with these communicative practices. And I help students get familiarized with genres, with the fields, with the different disciplines. And then there is the second element. It's the discussion of the pedagogy of multiliteracy, so the work of the New London Group and more recently Copen, Calancis, and others, where we talk about the knowledge processes that you go from experiencing to conceptualizing to analyzing and applying. So there is a moment that you have to have these experiences, experience what you know and what you want to know. We formalize into conceptualizing by giving names and by adding theories to it. Then this analysis of that, and then how we apply it appropriately and creatively to develop that particular discourse. So now let me share two examples of academic literacies in practice. And one more quote, this time by Anne Lamott, when it says almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. And I like this quote in particular because one of the fears we have to let go of as academics, as scholars, as teachers is the fear of writing or the fear of saying something. I know there are young teachers in the crowd, and some of you, I know you're very afraid to speak in public. Contrary to popular belief, there was a moment in my career that I was very, very afraid to present and speak in public. And I overcame my fear of writing, overcame my fear of speaking with life experience, training. So it's possible, and it will happen to you as well. But I think the key here, it's coming to terms with the fact that you are going to make mistakes. It's coming to terms with the fact that your texts are not going to be perfect, are going to be choppy, they're not going to look good at first, but you're going to make them a lot better. Now, let me pose a question for everybody, and I'll be quiet for a few seconds, as I would be if I am presenting this live. And let me pose a question for you. How easy or how difficult is it for you to explain concepts in your own words? And I want to clarify that particular part. It's not about citing everybody you need to cite. It's put it in your own words. How easy or how difficult is it for you to take a concept and explain it like you. Or as they say, there's this famous tweet, explain your research to a 7th grader, or explain your research to a 5-year-old, or explain your research to your grandmother, or explain your research to someone who's not familiar with the field. I'll be quiet for a few seconds, just let all of you think about this. All right, I gave you enough time to think. Probably you had some time to discuss. Probably some of you said that it wasn't easy. And it's not easy at first to own your own concepts. And we had that particular dilemma with my researchers, that we were starting to play with a lot of theory, and they were struggling with giving definitions that sounded like them and not like they were just paraphrasing what they, or powdering what they read. In that exploration, in that discovery of how to own the concepts we come up with, we came across the idea of microwriting, and we started experimenting with microwriting. So microwriting in general refers to this writing that is really short and goes into the essence in very quick bursts, in very quick moments. So these are very short, these are very short texts. Obviously, what we do is a little more elaborate than something that takes 3 to 10 minutes to complete, but it's the same idea, that you're going to make an effort to write something big and make it smaller and shrink it and make it something of a more manageable size, that it's more accessible. In that effort of doing the micro writing and in that effort of doing conceptual ownership, we came with an idea that I'm very happy to say has had a lot of very positive reception. Not in Colombia, but in other parts of the world, people have discovered our work. And it's this little thing we call the LSLP micropapers. What you can see in the slide is the aesthetic evolution of the banner that we started. We started with that little banner that we put in 2014 and 2015, when we had the original name of LSLP. Then we changed to the second logo, and we had that banner until 2016. Then until last year, we had this third banner. And then the one we're using today is the last one. And as I was preparing the presentation, I went back to look at all the banners, and it's interesting even how our evolution as writers is even reflected in the banners. Because you can say a banner, or designing a banner, is also another form of textual creation. And you can see how the drafts have evolved and how we have mastered the art of creating banners and creating logos over the years. So what are the LSLP micropapers? They're a web-based grade literature publication. We draw inspiration from our colleagues at the Center for Intercultural Dialogue, and they have a related series called the Key Concepts. In every micropaper is a primer. It's a very short document, and I'm going to show you an actual micropaper in the next slide that has concepts and theories that inform our work. Our current track record, since we started writing the micropapers in 2014, we have right now 81 micropapers, with several that I still need to revise and several that are still in preparation. Right now, we can say we have 9 papers that feature scholars from the United States and the UK. The expectation has always been that every member of LSLP should write at least one micropaper. Some have already written more than one. Some have done several of them. And we have a goal for next year that in 2022, Our goal is to make it to 100 micropapers, and then we'll see what happens after once. If we reach the milestone, we'll see what happens. The structure of a micropaper is very simple, and there are some ground rules. It can only be one page. It cannot be more than one page. There's no micropaper that is 2 pages long, and that it means that some people who have written first drafts, they have written like 2 or 3 pages, and I have to ask them to start shrinking. The structure itself, it has 4 sections. So one section is defining the term, and that's where our researcher or researchers who write the micropaper provide a working definition, a definition that should have no quotations. That's one of the key elements. You don't use citations. It's just your working definition that shows me how you understand the concept. So Cisco and Kylo, the 2 authors here, they decided to come up with a micropaper about the idea of gamifying, because we have one on gamification, so we wanted to update our understanding. Then there is a second section called connecting it to LSLP. So that's how we reflect how this concept informs the work we're doing, or how this concept can help us move a particular area of inquiry in our teams, how we can move it forward. Then there is the expanding second language research, which is a short reflection, 1-2 paragraphs, where we link this to second language education, to second language studies, to English education, to ELT. We link it to that and say this is how we see this concept having potential. Then the authors propose maximum 3 references as evidence of preparation, so 2 or 3 references, just to show that they did the work. From starting like around micropaper 44, we also decided to include hyperlinks. So you can see here, if you look at the micropaper, there are a lot of links in green. So those are linked, those are hyperlinks to previous micropapers. So we thought it's important to also show how all the micropapers are interconnected and how they're threaded as part of this knowledge construction. As I look back into the knowledge processes in the micropapers, I can go back and look at the idea of the pedagogy of multiliteracies, and this is how the knowledge processes fit within the micropapers. So in the experiencing part, first, the researchers get introduced to research and literacy theory, and then we talk a lot about writing and synthesis. They read the text, and then we're gonna go, when I look at the second part of this section, we'll talk about this idea that in this part also, now we also include the mentor texts. I'll get back to that in a moment. Then when we're conceptualizing, we always think about that triad of intention being design that I proposed for multimodal text. That also applies to these kinds of text, in the sense of who is your target audience, what you want to tell them, and what you need. In the self-design is what resources, what literature you need to write the micropaper. And you propose the idea. All the micropapers we have are proposed by the authors. Whether it is something that we're using in a project, or the guests, they propose a topic and we gladly accept, or we invite them to write on a particular topic. In the case of the grad students, they usually grant us a micropaper on that is related to the conceptual framework in their master's thesis. Then in the analyzing part, they have to write it, and there is a peer review, in the sense that no micropaper gets published without undergoing at least one round of peer review. One review is that they send it to me, I read through it, I give them suggestions, I make corrections, I send it back to the author or the authors, they work on it, they revise it, they send it back. I take one final look, then I send it back a final one last time for them to approve the final edits or to suggest any further edits. And we do not publish the paper, and I'll get to this part in applying, until such time when the authors are satisfied with the outcome. And that also implies that we get to understand the learning curve of academic writing in the process that it takes several drafts, it takes revisions, that no one gets a paper published as is. And the very few people to do that are people who are already very experienced scholars and incredibly gifted writers. And then the applying is the final edit that I suggested, the publishing, and of course the dissemination, which is all the process that we put it on the website, we make announcements on Facebook, we make announcements on Twitter, sometimes we make announcements on our Instagram, so people know that the micropaper it's already out. And we also make announcements in our internal virtual communities, so people know that the paper got published, and that's always a moment of celebration for us. Then as we move from microwriting, another feature of academic literacy started popping up. And it's an interesting one because it's the conferences. And it's understanding the conference, the academic conference, the congress, the conference, the symposium, as an academic genre that we have to understand so we can master it. So let's return for a moment to the definition, to the very definition of the academic literacies. So as Leon Street talk about the idea that academic literacies has to do with meaning making, identity, power, and authority. It's understanding the social dynamics. And again, that different institutions, different organizations, they have different ways to welcome or host knowledge. And that means that we have to think of this as something that is complex, that is dynamic, that is situated, and again, understand the power relations. That sometimes a paper doesn't get accepted. It's not because it's bad, but because you don't understand some of those power dynamics or some of those elements of that are germane to the genre that you want to present, you want to write about. In that sense, when we think about academic conferences, we have to think about it as a genre, where you have, for example, the proposal as a very specific kind of text. And writing a good proposal, it's an art form. Writing a proposal is and I think it's important to understand that the proposal in general, whether it's for research or whether it's for a conference, or it's a genre within academic literacy, within academic writing, within academic, it's a genre of its own that we have to understand and really recognize the different elements and the structures that compose the proposal. Then understand that when you present a paper, like I'm doing today, it's very different. And this is important especially for the undergrads and the master's students. Presenting your paper is very different from presenting a thesis. And sometimes I've been to recent conferences where our grad students, our undergrads, our master's students, or our doctoral students, they venture to present the work. But sometimes I get the feeling that they simply are reproducing the way they presented their thesis when they defended. And that lends itself to a very different kind of communication strategy. So you can present your thesis in a conference, but you cannot present it the way you presented in your defense. You cannot even use the same slides used in your defense. It's very different from teaching your class. For starters, teaching your class, it's very unlikely that unless it's something very, very particular, you're not going to be using PowerPoints or visual. You're going to be just doing mostly a cappella. It's the communication of the results. It's how you engage with the audience in your presentation and how you overcome that stage fright, the little butterflies, the shaky legs that you get before you're going to present. And then there's also the understanding of the texts that are at play in an academic conference. That we got the proposals, and we got the handouts, and we have the posters, and we have slides. Making a poster is very different from making PowerPoint slides, and making a poster is very different from, say, make a handout that you want to share with people. So you don't want to share the PowerPoint slides, you want to share a handout. those are different, those are genres. PowerPoint is a genre. It's not even the app, it's a whole genre. Making a presentation, whether it's on PowerPoint, whether you use Genially, whether you use Prezi or any other tool, it's a genre that is closely linked to the app or the program that you're using to present. Same goes with the poster. The poster is a very particular genre where you're not only thinking about the text, you're also thinking about putting images or charts, and that changes the way you present it. So think about that when you are preparing for an academic conference. There are different genres you have to learn to develop. And that's where mentor texts become essential. So when I'm talking about a mentor text, I'm talking about some samples of writing that you can use to learn, develop your own style. When you are reading for your work, for your research, and you decide to create a literature review, many of those articles are going to become mentor texts for you. It's never a bad idea, for example, before you decide to submit a paper for publication, that once you have chosen your journal, you go and look at recent issues and look at the kinds of articles they are publishing and the style that the different authors are using. So you can have an idea. And once you recognize, again, it's not to plagiarize, but it's simply to have a good understanding of the genre. And in that sense, it's important to have the mentor texts in the sense of PowerPoint presentations, in the terms of posters, in the sense of proposals. And in our team, we have been experimenting with that, in the sense that we're also beginning to develop this culture of presenting, this culture of sharing our work in different places. Local events, national events, international events, workshops with high school students, and et cetera, et cetera. And one thing we have is we have a mentor text database. So we have collected proposals we have written collectively over the past 6-7 years. And we just put them, we have them on our server, Google Drive server, and we have for all of them. And you can see ARA as a copy, ICQI and LRA and others, and then Symposium for Colombiana, and all the researchers have access to those files. So when we're going to start getting ready for a conference, all they have to do is simply go to the main app and look at the mentor texts and use that as a way to write a more successful proposal, because most of the proposals we have, there are proposals that have been accepted. Of course, we can also include ones we rejected, and we can talk about what went wrong that proposal got rejected. And within this presentation, this conference's genre culture, we also decided to add a little bit of our work on gamification. So we decided to do a little bit of gamification when it comes to the presentations. Our team, we have pointed out 4 major academic events that are our targets, our big 4. So the first one is always the ASOCOPI National Congress, because I think it's important for us to participate actively in one of the leading events in the region and one of the oldest events in TISM in the world. It's important to support the academic community, so we make sure to always include proposals for that. Second one is the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, a place that has been very welcoming to our work over the past few years. Since we do work in literacy, we go for the major literacy conference in the world, is LRA. And then, of course, we decide to go for all the marbles, and we submit also for the biggest educational research conference in the world, which is the ARA annual meeting. The idea, the goal is that all the researchers should be able to present in as many of these as possible. But it's not easy, because getting accepted at the ARA is difficult. Getting accepted at ARA is not easy. ASOCOPI and ICQI are far friendlier conferences, but still Not everybody gets to present in those. So what we have done, and this is where the gamification part sort of kind of comes in, is we recognize internally those researchers who have appeared as co-authors, who have actively collaborated in writing the proposal and preparing the presentation, even if they're not attending the conference. We still get credit for being presenters. So anybody who has 3 of those 4, we recognize that they did it, and we actually make a public announcement that they have reached the hat trick. So any 3 of those 4, if you get any 3 of those 4 over your time in the program, because getting all in 1 year, it's difficult. I mean, I cannot think of many my researchers have been able to do all 4 in 1 calendar year, but they have done it over their career, so we get the hat trick. Anybody who gets the 4, we also make a big recognition, and we say that they have reached the Grand Slam. We think this is important because, number 1, this is going to be in their CVs, but number 2 is evidence of the hard work the students are putting in to present at this event. And as part of this culture, we have realized that there was a really interesting perk as a consequence of the pandemic. And it's that as a consequence of the pandemic, a lot of conferences have gone virtual. And there are a lot of ups and a lot of downs and a lot of advantages and a lot of disadvantages about doing virtual conferences versus on-site conferences. But in our case, we have found that one big advantage is the possibility for people who might not otherwise be able to present to become massively involved in the proposal writing and the publication effort. And for us, virtual conferences have been a breakthrough. And as it happened last year, when we went to the International Symposium on Research in Foreign Language Teaching that our colleagues at Colombiana and Universitaria Tolima host every year. And we decided that it was going to be virtual. We decided to go completely wild. And we actually set our own record of presenting 13 papers in one conference as a collective. I think, and personally, I think that's a really, really big milestone. I cannot think of that many research groups in Colombia who can say, oh, we came together and we sent 13 proposals to one conference. I'm very proud of this because, again, we had 18 of us, 17 of the students, researchers, and myself presenting in these papers. Everybody in the 3 teams, and I'll bring that up in a bit at the end, we came together. And this conference writing event has also given us another interesting, how I call it, a side effect, if you will, which is what I'm going to talk about in the next section. This idea of how we use academic literacies as community building. And there's a nice quote from Isaac Asimov: I write for the same reason I breathe, because if I didn't, I would die. In the sense of writing or presenting or doing the academic work becomes second nature for us. Doing the academic reflexivity, doing the academic work becomes our oxygen when we start thinking about it. So this is all ingrained within the Literacy in Second Languages Project Lab, where we have the 3 teams, community literacies, digital and gaming literacies, and school literacy, and 21st century literacies in schools, symbolized by, in the logos, the shield, the star, and the apple. And one of the first things that we notice is how engaging in academic literacies help us in also develop this legitimacy through collaboration, where writing micropapers and presenting is part of our ethos already. We make this whole thing an academic event for us. So when it's time to start writing, for example, when it's conference season, and we did it again this year for Asocopi, we sent proposals. I'm not going to say the number, I don't want to jinx it. We sent proposals, plural. And it was an event that brought people together, that we communicated, we exchanged ideas, we helped each other. And the process of writing this is already it's an academic event. It also helps us legitimize the value of everything we do. We don't consider any presentation minor or of lesser value. Every micropaper we write counts, and we celebrate the publication of every micropaper because that is how we sustain our research. The publications in the journals and the book chapters are very important. But I think for us, the one publication that really nurtures our research agendas is the micropapers. That's our publications, the one we created. It's the one that we are deeply invested in, because that is the basis for all of the other writing that we're doing. And in that sense, this academic literacy culture means that for us, writing and presenting is not just a goal. Now the expectation is like, oh, it's an expectation that we're going to write, an expectation that we're going to produce knowledge. It's an expectation that we're going to share knowledge. And now that has translated into new forms of mentoring that are happening within our group. So on the one hand, now we have a nice cadre of advanced researchers who are becoming more and more involved in helping these researchers with the professional development. So it's a sense of helping them understand what it means to be a teacher, helping them find their own footing in their classrooms, giving them advice, giving counsel when it's needed. These researchers at the same time are working more closely with me so they can really improve their mentoring, and they can start getting engaged in more advanced forms of writing, like articles for impact journals, book chapters, etc. I continue my work with the novice researchers, where they still do all this learning about research and academic literacies. But at the same time, as there is a level of mentoring that I engage in with the researchers, I also feel that there is a level of mentoring I'm getting from them, where they help me really keep up to speed with things that are happening in schools. So they become reliable sources to help me also improve my mentoring with the novice researchers, and also help me teach my undergraduate methods courses better. So there is this sense of mentoring that covers everybody, because whether you're an early career, a mid-career, or the mentoring is something that you need at any process of your journey. And that also means that we have used academic literacies as part of building the Legion, in the sense that this is part of what we do, but it's not who we are. But the academic reflexivity permeates our work in our physical communities, in our virtual community spaces, in the kind of information we share, and how we see these academic literacies as part of a collective well-being, where it's not enough to say, to celebrate the publications. We also care and we worry when one of our researchers is having a difficult time. In the past year, we had researchers dealing with COVID and other issues, and we always rally around everybody. And it's in the sense that also we favor creativity, and we want to help everybody be as creative as they possibly can. So I'm going to leave you with just one final thought in this part of this journey, and the reason why we do what we do as academic and scholars. And it's this quote by celebrated writer Stephen King, when he says, "Writing isn't about making money, getting famous, getting dates, getting laid, or making friends. In the end, it's about enriching the lives of those who will read your work and enriching your own life as well. It's about getting up, getting well, and getting over. Getting happy, okay? Getting happy." And it's not just writing, it's the academic work. Sometimes we do academic work for the wrong reasons. Maybe it's time to start rethinking what the right reason should be to do the academic work. I leave you with that parting thought, looking forward to the questions that I'm sure are going to arise. A quick note of gratitude. My contact information, as well as that of my research lab, are there, of the Legion are there. Our website, our Facebook and Instagram, our Twitter and Instagram, my website, Twitter, and Instagram as well. And I always the joke says that you can never go wrong by putting puppies on a slide. So I always like to add a quick picture of Connor McLeod and Duncan McLeod, my dogs, who are the charter members of a little faction we have at LSLP we call the LSL Pets. So with that, once again, my gratitude for your attention to this keynote. I look forward to the questions that will arise and the conversation we're going to have in the next few minutes. So once again, everybody, thank you so much.